Hi, my name is Daniel Johns. I'm Managing Director of Water Resources East, and I'd like to present to you in this short video the findings of the draft Regional Water Resources Plan for Eastern England, and in particular, drawing out the implications for agriculture. Water Resources East is the independent, not-for-profit membership organisation set up originally in 2014, but spun off as a company limited by guarantee in 2019 in order to pursue long-term water resources planning for the benefit of all sectors in the east of England. You can see on the screen all the organisations that form our board, including the National Farmers Union and the Association of Drainage Authorities. So water companies are important members, but actually they are on the minority on our board. And therefore, we do represent all sectors as part of our independent membership. And we are delighted to be able to present to you this morning the draft Regional Water Resources Plan. It's also worth noting that our membership, our standard membership, grows to over 180 members now, spanning all different sectors, including individual farm businesses, as well as rivers groups, environmental NGOs, businesses, and others with a strong interest in better water resource management in our part of the country. But I wanted to present to you mainly today about the draft Regional Water Resources Plan, its findings, and then towards the end, talk about the further work that Water Resources East will be doing at the catchment scale to support agriculture, look ahead to understand the challenges for water resources and water scarcity, and some of the tools and modelling approaches that we are developing. The headline conclusion of our draft regional plan was that urgent action is needed by all sectors to manage the region's scarce water resources. And that's because the region is already classified as seriously water stressed by the Environment Agency, and 92% of rivers are falling short of good ecological status. So only 8% of rivers within the region are considered to be in good ecological health. And by the time you get to 2050, the deficit in water supplies will grow to as much as 640 million litres of water per day. And that's an all sectors figure, so that includes a portion for agriculture. Unless, therefore, unless we take action, we're going to see water scarcity, drought conditions increasingly becoming a constraint on growth in food production, growth in housing. It will curtail economic development in more general terms across the region. And of course, it will continue to endanger the East's iconic chalk rivers, peatlands, and wetlands. Part of our study, part of our report looks first of all at the amount of water being used today. Well, the baseline year for the report is 2025, and at that point we expect agriculture to form about 10% of the overall daily water use on average across the region. So 85% for the public water supply, but agriculture at a significant 10% of water use. And of course, within individual catchments, at individual times of the year, particularly during that irrigation season, agriculture is a very significant user of water, both groundwater and surface water abstractions. And if you look ahead to 2050 on the right-hand side of this chart, you can see that spray irrigation is the second largest sector today and is likely to grow, if not even double, in terms of its water use by the time we get to 2050. And the amount of additional water needed for agriculture because of climate change, because of longer, hotter, drier growing seasons, we could see a sizable increase, as I say, as much as a doubling in the need for water for spray irrigation. But at the same time, as the need for water is growing, the amount of water available from existing sources and abstraction points is going to fall. And that's primarily because of the need to return water to nature to improve river flows and ecological health. As I said earlier, only 8% of rivers are in good ecological health, and that's partly because of a lack of water resources and flows within those river systems. And whilst we have set out on the right-hand side of this chart, the overall amount of water on average that will be needed to return to the environment from existing kind of licenses are around about 20% loss of license volumes for both the public water supply and for agriculture. For some of those changes are coming through much more rapidly now in parts of the east of England, where there's already risk of serious harm, if not proven damage to local designated habitats. So license capping is already starting to take place. For the water companies, they would expect to lose about 150 million litres of water per day from their existing abstraction points. And that grows, more than doubles to 340 or so million litres per day by 2050. But we're talking about 60 million litres per day of water that agricultural users are currently have within their existing license volumes that will need to be removed in order to allow abstraction to fall to sustainable levels. And those changes in licenses won't be uniform across the whole region. Across the top of this chart, you can see what might happen for the public water supply abstraction licenses in increasing levels of environmental ambition running from left to right. And on the bottom, the three charts at the bottom are for agriculture, so for spray irrigators. To what extent can they expect to lose license volumes between now and 2050 in each part of the region? And you can see as you go from the least ambitious environmental scenario on the left toward the enhanced scenario on the right-hand side, you could potentially see some areas, some structures losing as much as 20, 40, if not 60% of existing license volumes in order to allow rivers to recover. And just to zoom in a little bit more, so you can see those scenarios in more detail, you can see parts of East Anglia in particular are potentially exposed to some of the greatest license reductions. And if you move to the enhanced, as say, the most ambitious environmental destination by 2050, which involves every river having the water resources it needs to secure good environmental flows, plus also additional protection for chalk streams, headwaters, and wetlands. Again, you could see actually more than 60% of existing license volumes needing to be removed progressively by the Environment Agency in order to allow good ecology to return to our river systems. For the public water supply, our plan sets out exactly where the 600 million or so litres of water deficit per day will be filled. And I partly present this to you because there's a clear parallels between what the water companies will need to do to resolve their deficits with what individual farmers and farm clusters and at the catchment scale that farm businesses will need to pursue. And the best answer, the first answer, should be about demand management, that water companies will pursue leakage control strategies. They'll remove water wastage as far as they can. They will try to use and encourage customers to use water much more efficiently. They'll get much smarter about the metering data that they have from people's homes to be able to understand exactly how customers are using water. And again, all of those are exact parallels with agriculture about understanding water usage, understanding what it needs to be used where, making sure that you're using water as efficiently as possible, not over irrigating, not under irrigating, and using the best available data in order to make sure you're irrigating at the right time and not overly irrigating and just wasting water in that way. On the supply side, because for the public water supply, demand side action only fills about a quarter of the supply demand deficit, there will need to be new supply side options, so more sources of water from sustainable sources to supplement and to replace those license volumes that they're going to be losing. Within the options, emerging through the 2020s into the 2030s, you get smaller options, quicker things, low-hanging fruit that the water companies will be doing. But there'll also be transferring water between parts of the region in much greater volumes than they do at present. So where there are areas of surplus water, they'll be moving them through transfers to areas of deficit. They'll also be reusing water much more and a much greater in much greater volumes, using wastewater, recycling it back to a drinking water standard and putting it back into supply. Also, reservoir storage, both for farming and for the public water supply, we do need to store more water within the landscape in order to use it, to capture it in the winter and then use it during those key spring and summer months for irrigation. So I'll say a bit more about the two major reservoirs that the public water supply companies are planning, both of which actually could potentially also support at least some agricultural use. And there's a water farm reservoir group, which is funded through Water Resources East, which is looking at particular at the opportunities for sharing water in the public water supply reservoir with irrigators at certain times of the year. Also note that by the time we get into the 2040s, we will need at least some desal plants along the East Anglian coastline in order to square the long-term supply-demand deficits and return water to the environment. And again, desal will primarily be for the public water supply, but who knows, maybe there'll be options in certain parts of the country where desal could be used in an agreed and planned way to support at least some agricultural irrigation. The plan sets out exactly when we expect certain options to come online. So on the left-hand side of this chart, it looks at 2030 to show that mostly in the next kind of 5 to 10 years, it will be about transferring water between different regions to make sure the water is in the right place as and when it's needed. You'll see that also there is a blue dotted line that runs from the Lincolnshire through Cambridgeshire and out into East Anglia. And this is the bulk supply pipeline that's already being built by Anglian Water, which will be ready by 2025. And that's a key part of the overall regional infrastructure, because it means that as well as the transfers that it can currently use, it will also allow kind of create a backbone really for these other water supply options to be plugged into as and when they become available. On the right-hand side, I just want to highlight again the Fens Reservoir, which is out for public consultation right now. It closes in mid-December. That should be online by the mid-2030s, and that's really a key part of the infrastructure for the region. Again, both to primarily supply households and businesses, but potentially also at certain times of the year with the agreement of Anglian Water and Cambridge Water to supply local farm businesses. And you've also got water reuse schemes starting to pick up in Lowestoft, Colchester and Southend. Moving ahead to 2040, the next big reservoir hopefully will be on stream, the South Links Reservoir, which is proposed to be near Sleaford. That will plug into the bulk supply transfer and move water around the region, provide much greater drought resilience for the public water supply, as well as allow licensed volumes to be reduced from where they're currently abstracting from. And by the end of the 2030s, you'll also potentially see some desal plants popping up there in Norfolk, in Suffolk at Felixstowe, in Essex at Holland-on-Sea, and potentially up here in Lincolnshire at Mablethorpe. And most of the heavy lifting in terms of the public water supply infrastructure will be in place by the end of the 2040s. So by the time you get onto the right-hand side of the chart, the 2050s, it's mainly about filling in the gaps with smaller options, additional transfers, just to kind of square those last parts of the supply-demand deficit. So that's the kind of regional scale picture, primarily for the public water supply, but all the options within WRA's plan have been chosen on the basis of the wider benefits that they deliver for agriculture, for the environment, and for other water using sectors. But that's not the end of the story in terms of what WRA itself is doing, because on this particular slide, you can see there's a series of projects we are pursuing at a much more kind of localized scale, at a catchment scale, because when it comes to agriculture, it really only makes sense to look at water resources at that more detailed level, at either the individual farm business level or perhaps as a cluster of local farm businesses. And these projects are helping to explore exactly how you can find the water that agriculture will need in the changing climate, in the context of needing to return water to the environment. And in particular, just to highlight the Norfolk Water Strategy Programme, which obviously is working in Norfolk to deliver nature-based approaches to securing water resources, whilst also tackling water quality challenges, helping to manage flood risks as well. And the Water for Tomorrow project, which is funded by the European Union, but coming to a close at the moment, delivering tools and data sets which will allow, again, small sets of farm businesses working collectively to explore exactly where their water may come from in future. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment. But you'll see in terms of all of our flagship projects, all but the Bedford to Milton Keynes Waterway, they all have agriculture as a particular area of focus. We want to, as a company, as a membership organisation representing different sectors, we want to make sure that agriculture is at the heart of our thinking. And that's because agriculture does face severe challenges. I showed you earlier the map which showed to what extent different parts of the region may face reductions in licence volumes in the short, medium, and in the longer term. And as I said, some of those changes are already starting to take place. The Environment Agency reviewed licences back in 2018 in order to avoid deterioration to existing water bodies under the Water Framework Directive. So cuts were made back in 2018 to remove excess headroom within licences if it wasn't being used, and in order to make sure that that no deterioration requirement within the legislation is met. But beyond that, more reductions will be needed over time in order to restore healthy flows. So it's not just about avoiding the problem getting worse, but actually about improving the situation to restore healthy flows. So whilst license cuts were imposed back in 2018, there will need to be further cuts in licenses in the next couple of years. So those same licenses could well be cut again when the Environment Agency looks at them and reviews them in 2024. And we expect the Environment Agency to announce their approach, that 2024 review, in the next 6 months. Just within East Anglia, that could impose changes. The scope of the review is around about 277 irrigation licenses, so really quite a significant number of licenses. And once the formal notice is given, then farm businesses have only 28 days to lodge an appeal, which will then be considered by the Planning Inspectorate with the ultimate decision taken by the Secretary of State. So it's not as if a letter will appear out of nowhere giving you 28 days notice of a change in license. The Environment Agency would always seek to give much earlier warning and be talking to potential irrigators affected by these changes months, if not years in advance. But the formal notice period has only a 28-day window for appeal before those changes, and then the changes would then be made several years potentially later. But certainly there's a key 28-day notice period between the notice being served and the irrigator choosing it or not whether to appeal. As well as avoiding deterioration and to restore healthy flows in the longer term, there are some parts of the region which are being affected today by where particular designated habitats are at risk of serious harm as a result of over-abstraction. And in those situations, it's not just about reducing licenses to perhaps recent maximum usage over a reference period of several years, or even going down to something like recent actual average license caps, which is some of the constraints being posed on the water companies. In some cases where you have serious harm, the Environment Agency needs to take more drastic action and potentially withdraw licenses altogether. And that's happening within the Ant Valley in northeast Norfolk, where 17 permanent licenses will be severely curtailed, if not withdrawn, with notice being given in January 2023. So the Environment Agency is already talking to all those abstractors, so they know who they are. They're probably fully aware of the kinds of changes they're likely to expect, but the formal notice will go out in January 2023. But as a result of a judicial review of the Environment Agency's approach to the Ant Valley SSSIs, a case which they lost, the Environment Agency is now having to extend the scope of this abstraction review to the whole of the broad special area of conservation. So instead of 17 licenses being particularly affected, it could be, again, several hundred licenses within the Broads SAC or affecting the Broads SAC that could be reviewed, curtailed, if not withdrawn. And again, the Environment Agency will be coming out with more details about exactly how and when those changes are likely to be made, but the changes are likely to be imposed by the end of 2024. Also coming down the track, if you've got a permanent license, a license of right, the Environment Act that went through Parliament just last year has a clause within it that allows the Environment Agency to change license volumes, but without offering compensation. So at the moment, if you're asked to change your license and you've got that license of right, you have available to you the right to claim compensation because of the loss of that license. But that is changing, and so from 2028, the Environment Agency will be able to change licenses without any financial compensation being paid, as long as that license needs to be changed in order to meet an environmental objective that's set out somewhere in statute or in a 25-year environment plan. Again, the Environment Agency intends to give as much notice of these changes as possible. So again, in 2023, the affected license holders should be at least given some advance warning of the kinds of changes they can expect before formal notice is given at some point later in the process. The final change happening, if that's not enough already, is that all licenses, both time-limited licenses and permanent licenses, will be transferred to the environmental permitting regime. And within that regime, there will be a 6-year review period. So again, permanent licenses will in effect become time-limited licenses with a 6-year review point, but they'll become permits under that regime as opposed to licenses. And the Ant Valley Water Resources Strategy Group, which is something that WRE chairs, has been set up because of these license challenges coming down the track. We realise that this is a very difficult process for farm businesses. There does need to be good dialogue between abstractor groups, between farm businesses and the Environment Agency and Natural England. And as an independent voice within this sector, WRE has been chairing the Water Resources Strategy Group for some time now, working with senior representatives of the National Farmers Union, the Broadlands Agricultural Water Abstraction Group, as well as the Environment Agency, Natural England, and Anglian Water, to try and navigate our way through these license challenges, where we keep talking and working together and collaborating, unblocking things where we can, escalating issues to senior Environment Agency people, as well as the ministers where appropriate, in order to smooth the process through this, smooth the process as far as possible, because we all want to see the environment improved. We all want to see abstraction moved onto a more sustainable footing. And the more we can do that by collaborating, working together, and unblocking the process, the better. And that's what the Ant Valley Water Resources Strategy Group is there to achieve. And now that the Broadlands, now that the Restoring Sustainable Abstraction Programme is broadening its remit to the whole of the Broads SAC SSIs, the Ant Valley Water Resources Strategy Group may itself extend its remit to help all farm businesses across the region through the abstractor group to be able to unblock the path towards investment in new reservoirs, transfer schemes, and clusters of farmers working together to use more water more efficiently between them. And building upon that, Water Resources East is working with the National Farmers Union to develop a much greater kind of sophistication in long-term water resources planning for agricultural businesses. So in the same way that water companies for 30 years or more have been thinking at a kind of regional scale, a catchment scale for individual water resource zones and for individual kind of assets and schemes, thinking about water resources 10, 20, 30 years ahead. And in the same way, we've been doing that now for the environment, through the Environment Act, through the 25-year Environment Plan, thinking about local nature recovery strategies, catchment plans, and down into the detail of individual landowners and schemes. We need to build a similar approach that helps farm businesses, either individually or collectively, in the context of our regional water resources plan, look at how exactly those additional water resource needs, how license caps and constraints will be coped with, where water will come from in future. We're building a set of tools and approaches with the National Farmers Union that takes the outputs of the regional plan and takes them down to the next spatial level at the catchment scale, and then down to individual abstractor groups, farm clusters, individual farm businesses, so that you have the evidence to look ahead, to see where the challenges may come from. And that obviously will play into your own kind of business plans, business models, crop choices and rotations for the years ahead. And that's a really exciting development. We're absolutely delighted to be working with the National Farmers Union on this, bidding for funding from DEFRA, from the Environment Agency and other sources, in order to build the tools that you need to support your long-term water resource planning. And one of the projects that's already underway, which we'll get into presenting its findings very shortly, hopefully early in 2023, is the Water for Tomorrow project that WRE has been leading with partners in France, as well as the Rivers Trust and the Environment Agency in England. And again, what we're doing for the Broadland Rivers catchment in particular is developing a set of tools that allow you to trade off different approaches to water resources management. Should you invest in demand side management, in trickle irrigation, in sharing water? Is it about large storage reservoirs? What are the different options available to you as either an individual farm business or a cluster of farm businesses within your catchment? To what extent does that give you the volumes of water that you will need in future years, but also importantly, the resilience of water resources in future years, given the potential for drought, given the potential for climate change? And so hopefully, please keep an eye out for the Water for Tomorrow outcomes as they're published early in 2023, and hopefully also a time for us to kind of bring people together to talk through the options, and again with the National Farmers Union, work out where we go next with the application of these tools. So just bringing things together, just to wrap up for you, some headline conclusions of the draft regional plan, which are relevant to agriculture, are those on the screen. So first of all, having learnt so much by pursuing this first round of regional planning, we would like the government to commit early to a second round of regional planning to make sure we don't lose momentum, particularly from a multi-sector basis. We would also like to see the government accelerate the timetable for for new policy on demand management. So tighter building regulations, better product standards, labeling for white goods, taps, toilets and showers. The more that the public water supply is used efficiently, the more that water companies can accept license caps and constraints earlier in the day. That leaves more water for the environment and potentially more water for other users. So additional demand management from government would be really, really welcome. But thirdly, importantly, I think from a multi-sector basis, is that we're calling for government to fund all of the regional groups so that we are funded on a proper multi-sector basis. At the moment, almost all of our funding comes from the water companies, and the water companies have been told by the regulator that they are not allowed to spend customer bill money on studies which benefit other sectors. So we can't use water company money to pay for studies that benefit agriculture. And we would like other sources of funding to be found from government in order to make sure that we as a regional group can support agriculture, support energy and the other water intensive sectors to think about and to provide for kind of long-term water resources planning. We're also calling on government to create kind of greater long-term certainty for all abstractors, including agriculture, about the impact of forthcoming license reforms. I've tried to set out to you today what we expect to happen in terms of changes to both permanent licenses and time-limited licenses, where there's risk of serious harm or where there's impacts potentially on longer-term environmental objectives. But we would like to, well, we call on the Environment Agency to give that as much certainty as they can, as much forewarning and as much notice of the changes that will be required to allow time for farm business to invest in other sources of supply, to invest in demand management and more sophisticated data sets and other things that allow them to manage water more efficiently. And we would also like to see a single approach, a single integrated approach to long-term planning for environmental improvement. You know, we have our models which are driven by assumptions. They do particularly look at the public water supply, but we know that water companies will be doing a further round of detailed investigations at a kind of water body and catchment scale, which would greatly benefit agriculture if it was done once and done as part of a single study. So we're calling on DEFRA, the Environment Agency, and Ofwat to allow water companies to pursue those studies and to do them once on a multi-sector basis. And lastly, we also make some sector-based recommendations for those sectors that we cover within the report. In particular, just to highlight the first section on farmers and growers, again, just echoing that call for longer term security of abstraction licenses, more notice about changes coming down to the track to allow multi-year farm planning and investment in new water supplies. We think abstractor groups are fantastic where they exist, but they don't exist everywhere. And we would like funding to come forward, not necessarily to WRE, but for abstractor groups more generally, through the NFU, through other groups, to allow abstractor groups to be up and running and be really effective across the whole of the east of England. And we would also like to see the consenting process for new winter storage reservoirs and simplified and accelerated, because we know that people are trying to do the right thing. Farm businesses are applying for both planning consent and new licenses to be able to fill winter storage reservoirs. And it is a really long and slightly tortuous process. And we think there is scope to accelerate that, to make sure that winter storage reservoirs can be built within a season as opposed to 2 or 3 seasons, which happens right now. Also, just to flag the important role that internal drainage boards play, particularly within the east of England, we think there's scope to extend their role, extend their remit beyond kind of flood risk management, water level management, into kind of water resources management as well. So it's part of an integrated approach to managing landscapes for the benefit of water in the round, water resources, water quality, flood risk management, and also increasingly for carbon sequestration. Yeah, the east is one of the areas that has the most lowland peat within the country, and restoring lowland peat means managing water levels much more sensitively, raising water tables where you can, either permanently during the course of the year or seasonally where that's possible. And IDBs have a really important part to play in that, but they don't currently have the kind of formal remit to do that. So that's it. That's the regional plan. I hope you find it an interesting read to go through. It is a draft plan open for consultation, which runs until the 20th of February next year. So we look forward to your feedback, and you can give us that feedback either using the online form, which again, you'll find on WRE's website, or you can write to us simply by emailing us at contact@wre.org.uk, or by writing to us by post at the Enterprise Centre at the University of East Anglia. So I hope you found this useful, and I look forward to hearing your thoughts. Thank you very much.